I was just sitting on my porch, enjoying a perfectly good Tuesday morning, sipping my coffee, watching the robins, when suddenly, 3 black and white county patrol cars screeched to a halt right in front of my cedar fence. It was so dramatic, I thought maybe I'd accidentally ordered a SWAT team instead of my usual sourdough starter. And then I saw her. The infamous Penelope Thorne, the self-appointed High Queen of our Juniper Creek HOA, standing there in her signature pink silk robe, waving a metal yardstick at my fence like she was measuring the distance to Mars. She was practically vibrating with fury, eyes narrowed, pointing at the wood as if it had personally insulted her lineage. A deputy, a tired-looking guy named Officer Miller, climbed out, muttering something about a repeat property line disturbance. Penelope, or Penny as she liked to be called by people she hadn't sued yet, immediately launched into a screech about how my fence had committed an act of war, invading her sacred border by precisely 16 inches. Not 15, not 17, but exactly 16 inches. As if that 1 inch made the difference between neighborly disagreement and an international security breach. I almost laughed, but I knew better than to encourage the kraken. See, Penny had been running this low-grade psychological operation against me for 3 years, ever since I moved into Lot 42. She'd convinced herself, and half the newcomers in our subdivision, that I was a creeping menace, constantly trying to steal her lush, but frankly, overgrown, backyard. I'd actually rebuilt that fence twice because of her relentless complaints, each time under city permit and inspection, and it passed every single time. Yet here she was again, shouting about trespass and punitive damages as if I'd repurposed the Berlin Wall and erected it in her petunia bed. For months, she'd been bragging at HOA meetings, citing some ancient, dusty subdivision map that supposedly proved my entire back half technically belonged to her. She used these lies like a crown, controlling the neighborhood by creating a culture of fear, forcing people to back her on every petty rule she wanted to enforce, from the mandated shade of beige on mailboxes to the precise height of your hydrangeas. Most neighbors just stayed quiet, exhausted by her sharp certainty, afraid of getting drawn into her vortex. I'd played the peacekeeper for a long time, choosing quiet over confrontation, but the day she filed a false report with the county, causing my home insurance to freeze pending a property investigation, I realized silence wasn't peace. It was fuel for her arrogance. That's when I decided to go nuclear, but legally, with certified proof, with patience, and with an ending she absolutely wouldn't see coming. The days leading up to this moment were pure theater. She started doing these dramatic, agonizing walks along the property line, clutching her dog like a hostage and glaring at the wood. She'd send me these official-looking letters through the HOA demanding removal, citing imaginary statutes, even including badly angled, grainy photos meant to prove the fence was listing to the side. Then, one morning, I caught her red-handed at dawn, creeping around with a tape measure she clearly didn't know how to read. When I called out, she jumped 6 feet, claimed she was looking for a lost golf ball, and then ran inside, her face the color of her robe. That night, I installed security cameras, not for thieves, but to capture the sheer, unadulterated absurdity. Little did she know, those recordings would be the least of her problems. As Officer Miller stood there, looking utterly drained, Penny dramatically demanded my arrest for property appropriation. Miller, bless his heart, just sighed and asked her, "Ma'am, do you happen to have a copy of your deed with you?" She fumbled through her oversized handbag, pulling out a stack of HOA pamphlets and 3 loose cough drops. I couldn't help but smile, because I knew what she didn't. I had already obtained a certified copy of her deed, complete with official surveys, directly from the county archives. And not only was my fence perfectly on my side of the legal boundary, but her precious little, decorative garden gnome shrine actually extended almost 2 feet onto my property. For years, she had been accusing me of the very encroachment she herself was guilty of. Then, the hero of my story arrived. The surveyor's truck, a beat-up Ford F-150 with a rotating beacon light, rolled up the street. The surveyor, a grizzled old gentleman named Mr. Silas, was the kind of person who'd seen enough suburban turf wars to remain perfectly neutral and perfectly calm. I watched Penelope's face transition from smug triumph to a flicker of genuine fear. Mr. Silas set up his tripod, opened his maps, and began marking the official stakes with practiced, deliberate movements. The police watched quietly, radios crackling. Penny stood rigid, clutching that metallic ruler like it was a cheap silver sword. The moment of truth arrived. Mr. Silas looked up, adjusted his bifocals, and announced, clearly and loudly, that the fence line was perfectly correct, matching the official survey down to the millimeter. Penny blinked, as if he'd just recited poetry in ancient Sumerian. Then, Mr. Silas added, almost casually, that the concrete pad for the structure behind her house, the gnome shrine, extended well past her property limit, directly onto the adjacent lot, Lot 42. The officers turned toward her. Penelope stammered, claiming it must be a mistake, that perhaps his laser-guided cosmic instruments were malfunctioning. But Mr. Silas simply handed her a printed map, signed and dated, proving that the boundary she had been using for years had been incorrectly marked in the HOA's old records. You could practically hear the collective neighborhood gasp. Curious neighbors started peeking over their hedges, whispering furiously. Penelope's face went from pink to a shade of beetroot crimson. I stayed silent, not out of mercy, but because I knew the real revenge was only just beginning. Officer Miller stepped forward and informed Penelope that she would have to remove the encroaching structure immediately or face a formal citation for code violation and county enforcement. She tried to argue, but the surveyor's official statement, the unassailable truth, ended the discussion instantly. As the officers left, Penelope stormed into her house, slamming the door so hard it rattled her faux antique shutters. That night, I sat under the porch light, enjoying a victorious cup of coffee. The neighborhood was quiet for the first time in months. No angry calls, no HOA letters, no drama. But I knew better. People like Penny don't give up easily. They simply regroup, scheme, and come back meaner. Sure enough, within a week, she filed a new complaint, this time claiming Mr. Silas was biased, that I'd bribed him with a six-pack of craft beer, and that the county's data was, quote, a digital defamation of character. I laughed, but I also knew it was time to move beyond defending my fence. It was time to expose every single lie she had built her reputation on. The next move had to be mine, and I was going to make sure the entire HOA board watched her entire house of cards crumble, rule by rule, lie by lie. The whole neighborhood was buzzing like a hive of very well-informed bees. People who used to avoid eye contact now gave me awkward waves, pretending they'd always believed my side of the story. Even the mail carrier, who usually rushed past, gave me a small, knowing grin. It felt like the calm eye of a massive storm, and I knew Penny treated losing an argument like a mortal wound. By noon, she had plastered the HOA's online forum with posts claiming the surveyor used outdated, unverified Soviet-era maps, accusing me of manipulating the county clerk and suggesting Officer Miller was part of a deep-state conspiracy. Her dedication to fiction was almost admirable. But what she didn't know was that I had already started compiling a dossier. Every email, every minute from old meetings, every recorded complaint she had filed since I moved to Juniper Creek. Each one contradicted the last, painting a clear picture not of a victim, but of a habitual, manipulative bully using HOA power as a personal weapon. Later that week, I was called into a special HOA hearing, scheduled in the clubhouse, supposedly to address boundary disputes threatening community harmony. Clearly, this was Penny's last-ditch attempt to twist the narrative before the truth became concrete. When I arrived, the board members sat in a semicircle, sipping coffee like a bored jury. Penny was at the end, dressed in a severely tight, formal navy blazer, surrounded by binders labeled evidence. She gave me that smug, proprietary smile of hers, the kind that says, I'm about to win back everything I lost. The president, an elderly man named George, cleared his throat and asked if I wanted to make a statement. I simply told them, no need. The county survey already has. I handed over certified copies of the same documents Mr. Silas showed the police, along with clear, dated photos of her structure violating the boundary. The room went silent. Penelope's expression flickered between fury and utter disbelief. She immediately accused me of photoshopping the images, claimed the structure must have shifted after a recent rain, and when that failed, she desperately blamed her late, lamented husband for poor construction planning 20 years ago. The board tried to calm her, but she just kept rambling, digging her own hole deeper with every screech. And then came the definitive boardroom twist. One of the newer board members, a quiet, brilliant woman named Tina, who worked in corporate real estate, spoke up. She revealed that she had checked the county records that very morning, not because she doubted me, but because she wanted to confirm the HOA's master boundary plan. What she found was absolutely shocking. The HOA's own digital map, the one Penelope had been citing to terrorize the community for years, was never, ever officially approved. Penelope Thorne, back when she was on the documentation committee, had illegally uploaded a substitute map that subtly expanded her lot size by several feet, giving her false authority during disputes. You could literally feel the air evacuate the room. Penelope froze, the realization of what she'd just walked into hitting her like a freight train. President George stared at her, pale and speechless. Someone in the back muttered, "That could be criminal fraud." I just leaned back in my chair, sipping the watery clubhouse coffee, and let the silence do its devastating work. After that meeting, the tone of the entire subdivision shifted dramatically. The same people who used to whisper behind my fence started stopping by my gate, offering cautious apologies or small talk. They confessed that Penelope had scared them into compliance for years, fining them for non-compliant patio furniture or mailbox heights that were a quarter-inch off spec. One man confessed she once threatened to revoke his access to the community pool because his children were laughing too loudly near her sunroom. She had successfully turned the HOA into her personal fiefdom, and now that rotten empire was finally collapsing. The board announced a full, forensic audit of all past property disputes, which meant Penelope's years of manipulative rule were about to be dissected, line by line. I watched her from my porch as she furiously paced her yard, phone glued to her ear, barking orders to whoever was left answering her calls. Her once loyal allies were scattering like leaves in a hurricane. The next blow came from the county itself. Mr. Silas, the surveyor, completely fed up with her continued harassment, filed a formal report documenting her false claims. The Code Enforcement Office issued a new, final notice. Remove the structure immediately or face escalating daily fines that would drain her bank account completely. When she ignored it, they showed up with an entire crew and marked her offending structures with vibrant orange enforcement flags. The irony was poetic. She, who had obsessed over a mere 16 inches of my property, was now watching every single inch count against her. She was so desperate, she tried one last petty act of personal revenge. I found her near my gate late one night with a cheap flashlight, muttering to herself like a character in a bad Shakespearean play. When I stepped out, she froze, pretending she was checking for, I don't know, leprechauns. I calmly told her she was trespassing. She snapped that I would regret humiliating her. I replied, "Penelope, the only person humiliating you is yourself." She stormed off, but the war had shifted. It was now utterly and completely personal. 2 nights later, my security cameras caught something that made me shake my head and chuckle with disbelief. Around midnight, she crept back into her yard, dragging a ridiculously tall ladder, and began spray painting the very top of my pristine cedar fence bright neon pink. It was the kind of childish, theatrical revenge you'd expect from a middle schooler, yet she did it with the determination of an artist completing a masterpiece. The next morning, half my fence glowed like radioactive cotton candy. Instead of getting angry, I simply took high-definition photos and sent them straight to the sheriff's department with the case number from my ongoing lawsuit. Within hours, an officer arrived, took one look, and sighed the sigh of a man who had officially seen too much in suburban America. Penelope tried to claim it was artistic expression and that my fence needed community vibrance. The officer was not amused. She was fined for vandalism, on top of everything else. As word spread, her reputation completely collapsed. She became the running joke of Juniper Creek, the cautionary tale parents used when telling their kids not to lie. You'd think this humiliation would calm her down, but she doubled down, walking door to door with ludicrous flyers claiming she was being framed by a fence mafia and that I was in league with corrupt local officials. The desperation had utterly replaced the arrogance she once wore like an armored gown. It wasn't about property or pride anymore. It was about her very identity. Stripped of her power, she was visibly unraveling. And as she spiraled, I prepared the final, quiet blow, one that wouldn't come from me directly. Buried deep in those HOA archives I'd collected was the one document she'd hoped everyone would forget. a transfer deed showing that the very lot she built her house on had a long-standing, pre-existing utility easement running through a specific corner of my property, an easement she had conveniently omitted from her fraudulent map. If that easement was still active, it wouldn't just expose her lies. It would mean her house, as currently configured, was legally non-compliant with her own community's zoning rules. The morning after the pink paint incident, the HOA newsletter dropped into everyone's inbox, and it ignited a wildfire. It included a short, carefully worded paragraph about recent property violations, pending fines, and an official suspension of HOA privileges. The moment it hit the neighborhood group chat, chaos erupted. Penelope tried to flood the chat with frantic denials, claiming the newsletter was part of my smear campaign, typing paragraph after paragraph, accusing the board of corruption and me of digital defamation. Within an hour, the admin muted her account for spamming. That silence, the absence of her voice dominating the conversation, was the most peaceful sound I'd heard all year. I spent the afternoon calmly repainting the fence back to its original cedar color, deliberately slow, whistling while I worked, knowing every brush stroke probably tortured her from behind her closed blinds. That night, though, something strange happened. My camera picked up a black SUV stopping near her driveway. Two men in work clothes unloaded massive privacy screens, the kind that cost a fortune. By morning, Penelope had installed them along her side of the property, creating a monolithic wall that completely blocked any view of my yard. It was her silent, final, desperate protest, her way of walling herself off from the truth. But there was a problem. She'd installed a significant portion of those tall screens over my land again, in the same corner where her shed had encroached. When I pointed this out to the county code officer who was monitoring her compliance, he just sighed, rubbing his temples, saying, "She is really testing the limits of this county's patience." He wrote another citation, warning her that continued encroachment could lead to a full-blown demolition order. The final hammer fell after the HOA audit results came back. Not only had she altered boundary maps, but she'd also been redirecting HOA funds to cover her personal landscaping projects for years. The treasurer found invoices billed to community beautification that precisely matched the new sprinklers, imported shrubs, and fancy stone walkway on her property alone. When the board confronted her, she claimed it was reimbursement for leadership duties. I was sitting on my porch when President George himself walked over, shaking his head. He told me they were preparing to remove her permanently and press charges if she didn't step down quietly. He thanked me, said my patience had helped uncover years of misconduct, and promised the community would finally be better once she was gone. I didn't tell him about the easement document tucked safely in my file, the loaded secret waiting for the absolute right moment. Then, one evening, I found her standing near my gate with a flashlight. When I stepped outside, she froze. She looked at me, her eyes raw and exhausted, and she whispered, "You don't understand. This fence, it ruined my life." I didn't shout. I didn't gloat. I replied calmly, quietly, "No, Penelope, your lies did." She dropped the flashlight and hurried inside, defeated. The finality arrived when the county zoning department, thanks to my quiet motion, issued a public notice of enforcement. The report was devastating. Her property not only violated the easement, but also intruded several feet into municipal land. The shed, the privacy screens, even part of her decorative back patio were all technically illegal. Corrective action was required within 30 days, or enforcement crews would intervene. 2 days before the deadline, a moving truck appeared outside her house. No one helped her pack. A single hired mover carried boxes to the truck while she stood on the porch, arms crossed, glaring at everything one last time. When our eyes met, she didn't speak. She just gave me a bitter, empty little smile, the ghost of her former self. When the truck pulled away and her car followed, the neighborhood erupted into a quiet, palpable celebration. Kids rode their bikes freely in the street again. Laughter filled the air. It felt like reclaiming peace after a long, strange siege. As the sun set, I walked along the fence, the same line that had sparked months of madness. It stood straight, clean, and completely unshaken. I realized that the fence had never been the problem. It was a mirror, reflecting every insecurity, every lie, and every fragile ego that had touched it. Penelope had seen it as a threat. I had seen it as a defense. But in the end, It was simply the line between right and wrong that neither of us had drawn. It had always been there, waiting to reveal the truth. Months passed. The house was sold to a young couple, Jake and Melissa, who brought laughter and barbecue smoke back to that side of the street. Everything was peaceful. Then, one morning, Jake showed me a strange letter he'd found in his mailbox. It was addressed to the true owner of Lot 42. The handwriting was messy, but the message was clear. You live on stolen land. The survey was forged. I knew. The queen was gone, but her shadow remained. I told Jake it was just a leftover grudge, but that night, my cameras caught it again. A figure in a dark hoodie, standing near the fence at 2 a.m., holding a notebook and a flashlight, just staring at the boundary before walking away into the dark. It was the same familiar posture. It was Penelope. The police issued a restraining order, but she had achieved her final victory. She had introduced paranoia back into the neighborhood. She couldn't win the war, so she chose to haunt the field. A few nights later, I found a final note tucked under my door, the handwriting shaky this time. It simply said, "You won. I hope you're happy." It wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening. It was just hollow. It felt like a confession from someone who had finally realized the war they started had destroyed them more than anyone else. I folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer with all the other documents, finally, definitively, closing that chapter. The fence remains standing today, solid and calm. It's no longer a line of division, but a quiet reminder of endurance. The trees I planted along it are growing taller, their roots steady. Penelope Thorne is gone, but her story is now a permanent part of Juniper Creek's folklore, a legend whispered at community barbecues. And the lesson? Peace doesn't come from winning battles. It comes from finally refusing to fight the ones that don't matter, and making sure the absolute truth stands taller than any lie. What do you think was the true motivation behind Penelope's obsession? Was it just about 16 inches? Or was it a desperate need for control? Have you ever dealt with a HOA Karen who weaponized bureaucracy against you? Drop your story in the comments below. Let's talk about where the line between right, wrong, and absolute delusion really lies. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life stories where the truth is stranger than fiction.